small islands by the plenty. Here are the list of tax havens that we identify, www.secrecyjurisdictions.com, and the ones that are highlighted in yellow are all directly linked to Britain, either because they're overseas territories or because they're crown dependencies like Jersey. We've got the City of London there, or because they're members of the Commonwealth. And what they all have in common are there several factors. First of all, the use of English common law. Absolutely crucial, because within common law and tax matters, there are some very, very important principles that apply globally to do with the taxation of companies, which are rooted in British common law. The use of British trusts, which is an Anglo-Saxon device, absolutely at the core of tax havenery. The focus on deregulation. These places are all part and parcel of Britain's drive to deregulate, to force a race to the bottom, not only on taxation, but also on regulation. So, quite clearly, as we said at the top there, the sun never set on the British Empire of secrecy jurisdictions. We in Britain have been very predatory in our approach to seeking to attract capital, not just out of the petrodollar economies, the Middle East and so on, but out of Africa, Latin America. We're not fussy where it comes from. We don't ask any questions, which is why London is the money laundering centre of the world. That's not my assessment, by the way. That is the assessment of virtually every single money laundering expert in the world. London is the destination of choice. And of course, London's helped in this enormously by the fact that you have this proliferation of British tax havens across the world, which act as conduits for the capital, which hide behind offshore trusts in Jersey and the British Virgin Islands and so on, and the capital is then fed to Britain. This is where I think I'm going to take a switch sideways and start talking about the resource curse and the finance curse. For those of you who aren't going to have the next slide, please. Oh, but before I do that, I just want to make a couple of points. I mentioned just now Britain's role in blocking every attempt at international cooperation at the OECD and the United Nations. The OECD is by and large a captive institution representing the interests of the richer countries anyway. But the United Nations isn't. And there's some good news here. I mentioned Andrew Dawson and his blocking. The good news is that China, India, Brazil, and many African countries are now resisting their power. One of the silver linings of the current downturn is that the United States and the United Kingdom have completely lost their influence. It is China, and I've watched this over the last 10 years. I've been attending this committee for over 10 years. 10 years ago, the United Kingdom, the United States, they were the powerful organizations laying down the agenda. You didn't read this in the newspaper. 2 weeks ago, India and China pushed through really important measures which will completely reshape the UN Model Treaty on Taxation of Multinational Companies in ways which will eventually lead to Starbucks and Amazon and others not being able to get away with it. But it didn't come from Britain. Britain's still trying to block that. But I suspect Britain's doing exactly the same at EU level. And I'm going to put it to you that one of the reasons why UKIP, which is very closely connected to the City of London, is so toxically anti-European, is not because they're worried about square tomatoes and straight bananas and this, that and other. It's because the European Union is trying so hard to regulate the City of London. And if we are to have any chance of regulating the City of London, it will come out of Europe. Because there's no political will, either within the Labour Party or the Lib Dems, or the Conservatives in this country, to regulate the City of London. Quite the opposite. You heard 2 weeks ago from David Cameron that we must make Britain more competitive by ensuring we don't regulate the City of London and by reducing taxes. Well, sorry, you do not make your industry more competitive by cutting taxes and deregulating. All you do is you take the pressure off them to compete in the market. You are subsidizing them effectively against other businesses. So I think that Britain's toxic anti-European agenda is largely driven from within the City of London to delude us about square tomatoes and straight and all this wall of regulation coming out of Brussels. Where we are putting the maximum effort in Brussels is into ensuring that Brussels and European Union parliaments cannot move forward with their attempts to regulate the City of London, and to create a cooperative framework around taxing of multinational companies, which is on the European Union agenda, but which Britain is constantly blocking. Have any of you heard, for example, of the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base Initiative? Please raise your hands if you have. Funny that, isn't it? Why? Because there's no discussion in Britain, because this is Europe's attempts to stop Britain and Ireland and Netherlands from being used as tax havens. So we can overcome the Google problem and the Starbucks problem and so on. And we've been blocking this for decades. Europe is well aware they're losing money by the truckload of tax revenues to these multinational companies. They're well aware of Britain's role. Unfortunately, within Europe, the tax policy can be vetoed by any single member. And guess which member leads the way. So let's very quickly talk about the resource curse, which affects oil and mineral exporting countries. There is this thing called the Dutch disease. It first affected the Netherlands in the late 1950s when oil and gas started to flow on shore. Immediately, the guilder, then Dutch currency, appreciated so strongly that within a matter of months, the Netherlands, which was then a major manufacturing and exporting country, lost its competitive edge, and a vast portion of their productive activity simply disappeared because their currency was appreciated so fast. That's called the Dutch disease. But other things started to happen as well around emerging mineral exporters in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. They all suffered from the Dutch disease to a greater or lesser extent, with the exception of countries like Norway, which took very active measures to stop it. But they were all impacted heavily by price volatility, which affected their domestic economic stability, rising incidence of poor governance, rising incidence of rent-seeking activity, in other words, that people investing not because they were not in productive activity, but looking for opportunities, perspectives of gains, rising incidence of political patronage. And the outcome of this, in many of the oil exporting economies and mineral exporting economies, slower economic growth, crowding out of their other industries, the development of an enclave economy, that is the oil economy, completely separated from the rest. There are very few linkages to the rest of the economy in terms of job creation and indeed local purchase. An increasingly a tendency towards authoritarian style of governance with political repression, political capture of the state, that is, because the tax revenues in these states by and large came from the oil industry, the politicians were able to deal directly with the oil companies and able to ignore the rest of their citizens because their citizens weren't paying tax, and therefore they weren't part of the bargaining process between state and citizens. Rising conflict, corruption, increasing poverty and inequality, rising debt, surprisingly, in many of these countries, and a culture of entrenched secrecy and lack of disclosure. These are the symptoms of the resource curse, which affects countries like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, and many other oil exporting countries across the world. But then, let's have a look at the finance curse, as Nick and I outlined it. It's the next slide.